Hello, and welcome to this presentation on the Cybernetic Trap Kit, Procedural Aesthetics for Virtual Augmentation. My name is Stephen Lewis, and thank you for joining me at the 2023 International Computer Music Conference. Now, during this presentation, I will be discussing my experiment into building a digital instruments and system design for the augmentation of the acoustic drum set. I will especially be going into the relationship between affordances and constraints as it pertains to this project. I will be doing that over the 3 stages of the development of this project that has kind of been ongoing for the last 3.5 years or so. And with specific respect to trying to design for transparency, flexibility, and versatility as it relates to the user experience. Because first and foremost, this is a project where the ultimate goal was to design something that acoustic drummers or drummers with not a whole lot of experience or background incorporating electronics into their performance practice would actively want to use, right? So trying to build something that would encourage them to incorporate electronics into their playing in an active and enthusiastic manner. So before I proceed into these 3 phases of development, I would like to give you a demonstration of what the current version of the Cybernetic Trap Kit sounds like, both from the position or the perspective of audio signal processing, and then one where it's just visual signal processing. So this is the audio signal processing demonstration performed by a great drummer in Los Angeles named Jason Harnell. And in this performance, Jason is first recording a solo improvisation, and then he turns the actual Cybernetic Trap Kit system on and proceeds to process that same solo. Where this recording begins here is right after or at the very tail end of his solo improvisation. All right, and for the visual signal processing demo, I'm going to be using similar techniques here. I'm going to be moving my hand into the submatrix that is surrounding the snare drum. And based upon my position within that submatrix and certain visual signal processing effects will be instantiated or bypassed or enacted either like through switching or through continuous control. All right. So one of the foremost challenges in constructing an interactive system for the drum set is in designing it to be as transparent as possible during live performance. The system's design had to function so as to not impede on the motions upon which a drum set player utilizes when executing a musical thought, nor on the sensory experience of playing the electroacoustic instrument. So in order to design an effective 2D based screen based musical interface, the programmer must apply their understanding of what perceptual psychologist J.J. Gibson refers to as his theory of affordances. The affordances of the environment are what it offers the animal, what it provides or furnishes, either for good or ill. The verb to afford is found in the dictionary, but the noun affordance is not. I have made it up. I mean by it something that refers to both the environment and the animal in a way that no existing term does. It implies the complementarity of the animal and the environment. The complementarity of the environment suggests that Gibson believed that affordances include properties of the environment and the actions that can be taken by the human within it. The definitions of affordances was made in the context of how mammals perceive the physical environment around them. However, designer Don Norman coined the phrase perceptual affordances to refer to the options unique to virtual screen-based environments. To Norman, there is a distinction to be made between the affordances provided by physical components that comprise the computer or any real-world tool or environment, such as the keyboard, the trackpad, the built-in camera, just to name a few, compared to the options provided to the user through the design of computer software. This distinction informs his approach to human-computer interaction, which he refers to as human-centered, natural-based design. This is an approach to designing environments where humans do not sense any type of resistance or struggle when interacting with a piece of virtual technology, and instead solely focus on achieving the desired end results of using any given tool. Often referred to as natural design, Norman's philosophy prioritizes the need to maximize the transparency involved in the interactions between humans and technology to the point where humans ultimately forget that they are entering a technologically mediated space at all. Now, as music technologist Thor Magnusson has stated, conceptual simplicity and common use functions are derived from an interaction model premised on transparency of use. A well-designed interface establishes the framework of an interaction model that enables the user to recognize the gestural options and utility afforded to them. This becomes especially important when the musical interface is a 2D video screen. The affordances programmed into virtual devices are more imperceptible than those designed into physical tools, be it a saw, a steering wheel, a violin, or a snare drum. These virtual screen-based interfaces also disembody the musicians from the tactile familiarity musicians acquire through years of development. In the case of the Cybernetic Trap Kit, a clearly defined interaction model between subject and object is an absolute necessity. So in digital design, the counterpart to the affordances realized to the user are system constraints built by the programmer. Constraints are established through parameter mapping, and the perceptual affordances of any system are realized through the user exploring the limits of its programmed constraints. Similarly, the physical and design constraints of any musical instrument define the way in which musicians can physically interact with its material dimensions. The expressive scope of this interactivity defines the constraints, which in turn reveal the affordances in any system. This is to say that in any digitally designed musical system, creative activity is assessed by how the users navigate its constraints while exploiting the affordances provided to them. Whether these features fall under Gibson's idea of environmental affordances or Norman's perceptual definition is determined by the constraints, not in spite of them. So simply stated, without constraints, there are no affordances. The constraints define the expressive scope of the instrument, and affordances are discovered through experimentation and interaction with the instrument itself. All right, on to phase one. So in phase one, there were seven different submatrices inside the larger video matrix. And these seven different matrices were referred to as either target zones, target sensors, and they had the ability to move. A drummer could position them exactly where they wanted to, exactly in a way that would be ergonomically beneficial for them. And so these submatrices inside the larger matrix were, as I said, referred to as target sensors, and four of them could be moved. The upper left, upper right, hi-hat, and ride zones could be moved. So basically the corners, the bottom corners and the top corners could be moved. The user was not able to change the rate or range of their movement, but the moving target zones could always be reverted back to their original position. And the image you see at the bottom middle there is the default position for every single moving target zone. Saturation effects were applied to each submatrix as a way to contrast with the grayscale video feedback of the entire camera feed. This made a clear distinction between the motion occurring inside and outside of the specified target zones. The computer vision technologies that were used inside the target sensors to control audio processing were frame differencing and spectral centroid tracking. Yes, so these mapping techniques were programmed into the system and unable to be changed by the performer in real time. The parameter mapping relationships could be established between the position of each moving target zone and the gestures occurring inside of those zones. These relationships were referred to as moving target mappings. The moving target mappings controlled the spatial and amplitude balance between dry and processed sounds as well. This was done by randomizing the position of the upper right or upper left target zones. Once this process is initiated, any movement of the upper right target zone along the horizontal axis controlled the panning of a quadraphonic speaker arrangement, while the horizontal movement controls the panning of dry and processed sounds. The vertical movements, when automated or when motion is randomized, manage the amplitude level balance between the individual effects, which included a comb filter, bit crusher, and multi-tap delay. So anyway, let's take a listen to a phase one demo. All right. So, in terms of evaluating phase one, while the mapping constraints yielded some interesting sonic results, the affordances provided by these map constraints were a complete mystery to the user, which made them seem even more opaque to the observer. Right, the performance interface you see there provides very little information, which indicates what the submatrices do or how the user is supposed to interact with them. With such little instruction provided, the user had to develop these connections in real time instead of interacting with the software as a musical counterparts or a complement to their regular acoustic environments. Now, while making connections between the gestures and sonic outcomes was supposed to be somewhat of an emergent process, the design's minimalism just added difficulty to discerning these relationships. The system afforded the performer very little in terms of exercising their own creativity within the very stringent constraints imposed upon them. The moving target zones were intended to extend the gestural possibilities at a drummer's disposal. However, since the gestural movement inside the submatrices was responsible for processing audio and not the movement of the matrices themselves, the user was forced to perform gestures that were somewhat divorced from any physical motion required to play the acoustic drum set, especially if they wanted to augment the instrument's sound in real time. So while this was incredibly transparent, it was also pretty inflexible from a user standpoint. The performer was not able to designate any mappings between their own moving target zones, gestures, and sonic outcomes. This proved to be too much of a constraint on the system. In summary, a minimalist interface aesthetic lacking in any data or text-based information provided an interesting visual component, but it did not translate to the user having any sort of clarity in knowing how to interact with the software. The movement of the matrices produced too much of a game-like environment where the user felt like they were competing against the software instead of mediating with it. The time it took to discover the few constraints and affordances of the system was unnecessarily long and perhaps impossible to do if the user was not also the programmer and designer of the system. And perhaps most crucially, the technological limitations of using only frame differencing and centroid tracking as the means for audio processing produced results that were somewhat limited in range and scope. So it became increasingly apparent that the amount of computer vision based techniques and measurements in the system needed to be expanded while the interface itself needed to be clarified. Phase 2. Now, phase 2 was dedicated to providing a much simpler user interface and experience to the performer. So every single submatrix was eliminated but one. The remaining single submatrix was still able to move around a section of the larger video matrix. Yet this was only for the purposes of providing an option for the drummer to move that matrix into a place that best served their own performance. The number of computer vision technologies was expanded as well. These additions included blob centroid tracking and optical tracking. Rather than using frame differencing inside 7 different submatrices, the performer could rely on other tracking techniques that provided more useful data for the purposes of processing audio. Frame differencing is effective for measuring extreme changes in motion on a frame-to-frame basis, but is not necessarily conducive for providing gradually changing data. Other techniques, such as measuring for concentrated areas of light inside the submatrix and tracking how these areas change over time, were more effective for generating data for processing audio over long periods of time. Switching to blob centroid tracking and optical tracking facilitated these subtleties in data acquisition inside the single submatrix, resulting in a more fluid experimentation with gesture. Now, frame differencing was still used, although in a completely different manner than in phase 1. The video screen interface was separated into 4 rows and 4 columns, all of equal size. Frame differencing operations could be performed on each section. The incoming measurements were continuously evaluated against a set threshold, and virtual buttons were used on the video screen interface to indicate when a gesture exceeded this set value. If the incoming motion exceeded the threshold, then the activity would trigger the process or event that was mapped to that particular region of the screen. For instance, frame differencing values on the rightmost column of the video screen would simultaneously trigger the playback of an audio file and switch between the primary camera view and a generative feedback effect. The two leftmost bottom regions triggered virtual synths that were now included in the performance system. So the user can now generate and process sound in real time. There are more flexible mapping options at their disposal. And I'm just going to play a short demo right now.
Nobody ever saw a shape that wasn't colored. Nobody ever saw a color that wasn't shaped. They always go together.
All right. And so the user also has the ability to map any video data point or any measurement to a particular processing parameter. So this is one of the audio processing modules. As you can see, the user can specify exactly which data point they want to use. They can scale the output, right? The range, the inputs to outputs. And then they can create presets and change presets within the performance. Now, a number of issues still lingered with this design. As you saw, the performer had to look at the screen-based interface and this larger like system interface while performing. So phase 3 was dedicated to alleviating this issue, right? So that to put on, first of all, consolidating the system interface to make it more streamlined and more easier to navigate in real time, but also mainly to program a system that allowed the user to organize time in an automated way. So all that they had to do was focus on the screen-based interface during performance. Currently during phase 2, the way in which the composition or improvisation evolved was through simply that, their own performance or decisions during improvisation. So what was lacking in phase 2 was a single cohesive interface to reference and also an automated way to organize time. Phase 3. Now, phase 3 represents the most technologically and conceptually sophisticated design of the system to date. More computer vision techniques have been implemented into design, yet the complexity involved in monitoring the software during performance has been greatly reduced. Blob framing, blob rotation, and face tracking have all been added into the system. This data provides far more control to the user and more options for parameter mapping. These measurements provide the size, movements, and rotation of each blob tracked in the submatrix. From a technological perspective, these are the most consequential additions to the system to date, as the movement of this tracking data best resembles the way a performer would move a dial or slider on an analog interface, right? And as you can see, there are more visual effects added to the top blob or frame differencing regions that the performer can activate. There's also ways to switch which blob tracking measurement you can see in the submatrix by activating them on the right side. You can also still activate or generate the sound from the virtual synths, the bell synth, the bass synth at the bottom. And you can also see many other measurements. You can see your spectral centroid. You can see which direction your hand is moving. You can see the speed at which your hand is moving. You can see how many blobs you are generating at once. And you can also see how steady you are and for how long you have been steady, which is typically a measurement that is tracked when your hand leaves the submatrix. Now, this is really what the interface looks like now you can see that, in my opinion, the beginning of phase 3 looks a little inelegant, and there's a little bit too much information on the screen. This is actually the same amount of information, but with a much more user-friendly design. This is a great drummer, Mark Ferber, who is demoing the Cybernetic Trap Kit, which he did in late August here in Los Angeles. And so this is just a far more elegant design, and this is the design that's being used going forward. All those squares can still be triggered through frame differencing. The bottom right-hand corner is a region used for optical tracking. The system also has two distinct sections now, one for video and one for audio. Any video controls are at the top. All the audio controls for the system interface are at the bottom. You can now organize time and automate it. You just simply make a signal routing, save it as a preset, and then can jump from section to section because sections are interpreted as signal routings, which are presets. So if you just hit start on the score control panel, you actually will transition from one section to one section automatically. So the user does not really have to do anything in terms of monitoring this system interface during performance. So it is at this point in the development of the creative process that this system represents a technologically mediated strategy for what composer and professor Sandeep Bhagwati refers to as comprovisation. And he defines that as an approach to creation in time-based arts predicated on an aesthetically relevant interlocking of context-independent and contingent performance elements. Comprovisation often uses unique constellations of oral, written, animated, and interactive scores that can accommodate the scoring paradigms of many traditions. Now, the design method described over the course of these three phases represents a procedural, system-based, integrative approach to composition, with the comproviser is at once the programmer, designer, performer, listener, observer, and mediator of this hybrid environment. Such an orientation requires iterative prototyping, and the need to reconceptualize the creative environment and the resulting aesthetic outcomes based upon the instant auditory and visual feedback yielded from the processes involved in this particular mediation with virtual and sensor-based technologies. Therefore, the term procedural aesthetics refers to both the iterative nature of how design choices are made and the dynamic, unfinished programming environment from which this technological mediation takes place. Time is organized and sound is generated and manipulated within a system made from an open programming environment and not a digital audio workstation. To hear the outcome of their design choices, the user does not have to play back a virtual tape machine, but has to rely on recursive operations that organize the playback of musical ideas in real time. Even the recursive operations controlling the processes have to be determined and built by the musician and programmer themselves. Observing musical and visual processes happening right at the point of programming changes the way the comproviser listens to the last decision that was made. This process is perpetual. The way time becomes organized and how sound is generated feels systematic in preparation, yet dynamic in performance. And that is my presentation for you. Thank you very much.